This is the widow of a traitor, and moreover, a traitor accused of incestuous sex with his sister, the Queen of England. This is the sort of thing people die for.
Yeah.
There are hags, and there are, sluts, but there is no idea. There's no stereotype of a scholar. There's no stereotype of an artist. There's no stereotype of female genius. But she's obsessively addicted to sex, so much so that her particular kink is sex done by queens of England.
Very, very particular.
Very specific.
But,
Very particular and very high risk. Extremely high risk.
Adultery, incest, treason, insanity. The Tudor court had it all. And in the eye of the storm was the wicked Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn. The woman whose alleged testimony condemned her husband to death on the charge of incest with his own sister, Queen Anne Boleyn. The deposition, which may have been the killing blow, delivered the siblings to the chopping block on Tower Hill. In a court notorious for chewing up and spitting out women, Jane Boleyn kept her head longer than most. But her strategy for survival has marred her legacy. Was her testimony really the nail in the coffin for Anne and George? Was she really a conniving, jealous traitor driven to insanity? Or was she a skillful survivor in a system built for her destruction? From the heart of the Tudor court, this is After Dark.
Hello, my name is Anthony.
And I'm Maddy.
Now, Tudor history is something we've enjoyed covering on a lot of previous After Dark episodes. We have covered the final days of Anne Boleyn. We've talked about Tudor sweating, sickness, the plague, of course. But today we have something altogether more special than any of those. We are very, very excited to be joined by the incredible historian and author, Philippa Gregory. Philippa, welcome to After Dark.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Now, this is an exciting time because we have a brand new book called The Boleyn Traitor coming out on the 7th of October, 2025. So we were talking about this before we came on air. You are heading into a really busy time. You're already in a really busy time. Just give us an insight as to what it feels like for you as an author before the book hits the shelves. How, you've been doing this a long time, you've had such huge successes, but I would imagine it still feels like a very raw time.
Well, it's a very interesting time because there's a terrific appetite for this book. There's a lot of interest in it already, but there aren't very many readers. So it is a bit sort of on the top of a diving board, like, how's it going to go? And publication day is not the day that people get their first copies because obviously reviewers get them a bit before. But usually it's after publication that you start to get the reviews. And there is this really big sense of, how's it going to go? Is it as I think it is? Are people going to read it as I intended it? Are people going to go completely nuts about it, which sometimes happen? Is it going to be as well received as I hope? So it's a sort of a Christmas Eve with a little bit of Halloween thrown in.
Oh, you're naming all the best times of the year. So this sounds like a good time to be in. Yeah.
Now, Philippa, I'm sure it will be a huge success, but this is far from your first foray into the Tudor world. What is it about that particular period, those particular collections of people that interest you, and why do you think people want to keep returning to that?
Well, I think politically it is one of the most interesting times in all of English history, that it is the time that what has been a sort of rule of the lords of a quite dispersed country in which, for instance, people in Cornwall don't even speak the same language as people in other parts of England, and someone in Yorkshire couldn't understand someone who lived in Southampton, say. It's quite a dispersed country. It's been in 100 years of war with France, so it's quite a poor country. It's had this massive War of the Roses, so it's a country accustomed to internal enmity. And out of all of that, the Tudors start to pull together the power on themselves and on, interestingly, London and the southeast, but very, very much on this one family, and of this one family, on this one person, Henry VIII. And that's really the start of tyranny. and it's an extraordinary thing to be in our time now and look at in a period of history when obviously a lot of countries are embracing the idea of a strong male leader, and see there's England doing it in the 15th century with disastrous consequences for the Parliament, for the Lords, and especially for the women of the court.
Can I just say,
yes, yeah.
this is why I love having people on After Dark, guests who are both historians and fiction writers, because the way, Philippa, that you speak about that period, the way that you weave together that story, it's just so evocative, and it makes me excited. As someone who works predominantly on the 18th century, it makes me feel so excited about the Tudor period, actually. And I think I'm always fascinated by it, and I know we'll talk about this as the episode goes on, but the space that you occupy, where you straddle the world of history and the world of fiction, and the way that you meld those two together is just so exciting to me as a historian. I absolutely love that. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thank you.
One of the things, you're talking about some of the figures there, Philippa, like Henry VIII, and we're hearing about this power coalescing around Henry, and some figures and some histories that we might be a little bit more familiar with. But one of the people that I wasn't very familiar with takes centre stage in this new book, and has a really interesting history of her own, and is very, very... her tenacity is quite interesting, and her approach to this world, because, you're saying the world is being reshaped to a certain extent, and therefore those interacting with that world have to change the ways in which they're interacting. Enter Jane. Tell us a little bit about Jane Parker, as she initially is.
Yeah, she's the daughter of Lord Morley. So she's sort of upper aristocrat. He's not a power broker at court. He's a scholar. So he's very much distant from the court. He turns out when he's ordered to, but his great love is scholarship and living in the country. And he makes a good marriage for his daughter Jane to a neighbour, someone whose lands are adjacent, and they are the Boleyns. They're, rising gentry, not quite yet nobility. The father, Boleyn, is married into the House of Howard, so they've got a noble connection. So you've got, they're not middle class by any means, they're above that. But in the Tudor world, they're not grand families. Yeah. And Jane goes to court and is the maid of honour to Katherine of Aragon. And so is a career courtier at court as her young husband. She marries him after she's been at court for a while. As her young husband is a career courtier at the court of the King, Henry VIII. And then, of course, the jackpot happens for the Boleyns, and Anne Boleyn pulls off this extraordinary coup, which is again both personal and political, in that she persuades Henry to abandon his wife, Katherine of Aragon, and marry her. Cue, so many other changes, the Reformation, everything else you can think about. But Jane, in that sense, suddenly jumps up to being sister-in-law to the Queen of England from no preparation whatsoever. Yeah. Suddenly, bang, they're there. And suddenly they are the ruling elite, just as Henry is starting to concentrate power on themselves, and by her own incredible political skills and her personal skills, concentrates Henry's authority on her. So she's advising Henry. She advises him against Cardinal Wolsey, the traditional advisor of the King of England, and she builds her own power base in court. And we start the novel pretty well while Anne is hoping to confirm that power base with the birth of a son and heir, and thus guaranteeing the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor Boleyn dynasty, and their power permanently. And Henry is still in love with her, and that still looks like it's going to happen. And Jane's career then falls dramatically with the Boleyns. I argue, unlike your introduction, that she does nothing to help the fall of her sister-in-law and her husband. I believe there are witnesses to Anne's behaviour, but I don't believe Jane is one of them. We've got one document that says that she will try and speak to the king for George, her husband, so she may very well have been trying to save him. And then what's the $1 million giveaway for me is that when the Boleyns are killed, George and Anne are executed, and father disappears, sister disappears. You don't hear a peep from any Boleyn for years. Jane Boleyn gets promoted. She becomes Jane Seymour's lady-in-waiting. She gets an Act of Parliament is passed in order to give her a better dower as a widow than she was entitled to, though she's the widow of a traitor and should, in theory, get nothing. And you have to say, well, I have to say, nobody has said very much before, but it would be wise to say, how has this happened? This is the widow of a traitor, and moreover, a traitor accused of incestuous sex with his sister, the Queen of England. This is the sort of thing people die for, and yet Jane rises up to be Jane Seymour's lady-in-waiting, and from there continues to be lady-in-waiting to the subsequent queens until she makes her final fatal mistake.
She's such a fascinating character, Philippa, not least because it's so hard to access what was going on in her mind. You talk about this extraordinary climb through the ranks that she's starting, yes, from a privileged position within this world, but she, because of the association with the Boleyns, ends up in stratospheres that she wouldn't otherwise have found her way into. And I just wonder, as a novelist, how you approach someone who is so hard to define and around whom there is so much ambiguity in terms of her motives, in terms of the actual behaviour that she did, what she did or didn't do to Anne and George. So what's your starting point for a character like Jane?
I think the starting point is the history, and the way I like to write historical fiction, my starting point is always a history. So first of all, I try and figure out what she's doing. You can never know with a historical character prior to the age of diaries. You can never know what they're thinking, and even then they're probably lying. So, you have to start off with what are they actually doing. So I trace her career. In my research, I trace her early career and then her marriage and then this inexplicable rise. And then I start to speculate as a historian, how could this be explained? How is the logical explanation for this? So previous historians have been very satisfied with sort of a psychological and condemnatory and a stereotype view of her. So Victorian historians in particular, who are the great historians of the Tudor period, so you come across them all the time, but what they tend to say is that she's a bad woman. Her brother was having an incestuous relationship with his wife, or at any rate, she didn't keep him home. Whatever he's doing, it's not right. So she's a bad woman on account of that. And then subsequently, she's involved in another adultery case. So she's a sinful woman in the point of view of the Victorians. And that's your entire example. That's a solution to the question, what is Jane like? She's a bad woman. End of story. Then you come ahead to the sort of the years where people start looking for a psychological explanation, and you're past the years, past the 60s of, as it were, women's lib. So people are prepared to look into what they imagine as being her inner thoughts and fears. And they go like, she's involved in 2 adulteries. She's certainly a in the room witness for one of them. She's a sexual voyeur. That explains what she's doing. So now we haven't got that she's bad anymore. We've got that she's obsessively addicted to sex, so much so that her particular kink is sex done by queens of England.
Very, very particular.
Very specific.
But,
Very particular and very high risk. Extremely high risk. So that doesn't make much sense. And then you go forward into our age, which is even more psychological in its search for explanations. And our age comes up with the fact that at her death, she is diagnosed as being insane. And so there you are. She's just crazy. And I think it takes a woman of some common sense, and also a woman who doesn't believe in the stereotypes of women, in this instance, me, to go like, obviously, she's not.
These are true.
She's not sinful. That's not an explanation for anything. Obviously, she's not a very, very, very particular voyeur. If she was addicted to sexual voyeurism with her money and the class she's in, she could satisfy it every single night without getting involved in the adultery of the Queens of England. That's mad. The idea that she is in fact mad, I think, completely ignores the fact that at the time she, I think, pretends to be mad, or at the time she is diagnosed as mad, there is no death penalty on people who are recognised as mad. So it's a completely rational way of saving her own life.
Strategy.
And it would have worked very, very well, except she failed to allow for the incredible vindictiveness of Henry VIII, who changed the law so that he could execute a mad woman, indeed her.
I want to zone in on one particular point in this history, and we'll do this with different points as we go through this. But I want to talk about what has been termed the first betrayal slightly. And you alluded to this in terms of what we mentioned in the introduction about this potential betrayal of her husband, George, and how you don't really see that in the archive, and it doesn't really present itself in the novel either. Can you talk about what that betrayal was supposed to have been, what we have received that, and say how you circumnavigate that in this novel?
Well, the betrayal is supposed to be that... again, you go back to the Victorian historians.
I thought as much, yeah.
It matters very much to them that Anne, mother of Elizabeth I, their top favourite historical character, is not, in fact, an adulterous, bad woman, as you would be if you were an adulterous woman to a Victorian historian. So there's a real desire by the Victorian historians to exonerate Anne and to suggest that this is a show trial. So therefore, everybody who gave witnesses of George and Anne's intimacy, which was put together by mostly Thomas Cromwell, to make it into a believable charge of Anne's adultery with many men, including her brother. All of that, you've got to find some way of blaming it on others and show that it's exactly a show trial. It's not true. We now think, as modern historians, that it probably was a show trial, that it is unlikely that Anne Boleyn had sex with this many people, and the evidence for that is pretty good, that the dates and the places which are cited are simply not credible. She's not even there for a lot of them. There's a very good reason for her having sex with somebody she could trust, in that Henry VIII is reported as being impotent even then. So certainly George is executed probably because he says in court that the king is impotent one way or another. So, but there's a whole sense of like, this is not a proper trial. This is not proper evidence. Who is responsible for the accusation? And it's very, very good for the Victorian historians to say it's his wife, horrible Jane.
Yeah, another woman.
Another woman, probably jealous. You know?
Yeah.
You've got this really great story of female rivalry and female malice, and this powerless woman who gains the greatest power by betraying her husband and her sister-in-law.
It's a very deeply Victorian narrative, isn't it, of these women being pitted against each other. There's just not room in that version of the history being told for more than one woman to exist and to have any kind of complexity. Philippa, you mentioned Thomas Cromwell when you were speaking then, and I just wonder if you can say a little bit more about his possible relationship with Jane, because you have a bit of a theory on this, don't you?
Well, yes, Thomas Cromwell, I think, is the only man who had the power and ability to change the law so that she got her full dowry, indeed more than her full dowry. So she ends up with Blickling Hall in Norfolk, which is now post-17th century rebuild, but even at the time was an enormous palace and huge estate. So she's a very wealthy woman in her own right. She doesn't need to work anymore at the Queen's court. Thomas Cromwell, I think, is the only person who could have got that for her from the Parliament. And Thomas Cromwell is probably the only person who would have placed her at the head of the Queen's ladies for 3 subsequent queens. And we really see, I think, why he does that when we see that when Anne of Cleves comes to England and Henry VIII turns against her and wants a divorce, then there is witness statements about the incapacity of the two of them, Anne and Henry, to conceive a child. He is recorded as being impotent and she is recorded as being a completely innocent virgin. And the witnesses who provide this unlikely account are led by Jane. So I think Thomas Cromwell puts her in place in the Queen's rooms, and she does exactly what he needs at that point, which is produce incontrovertible evidence that Anne of Cleves has said that in the morning Henry VIII kisses her and says, "Good day, sweetheart," and she says, "Good day." And she says, in Jane's account to her ladies, she didn't know there was anything more than that to bedding a king. So you go like, this is a woman who's been sent by her family to England to get a son from the King of England. That's her only job. That's the only thing she has to do. And they have sent her, and she doesn't know anything about sexual intercourse at all. This is not a Victorian girl. This is a girl in the medieval world who will have been brought up seeing animals on the farm all the time, who will inevitably have heard bawdy jokes and bawdy stories, who knows the laws about impotence, who knows what happens in the church courts about impotent and barren marriages. She knows absolutely. And also, she's not speaking English at this time. She is not going to say to her English ladies in waiting, "In the morning, the king says to me, 'Good morrow, sweetheart.'" Right. She doesn't have those words. Yeah. But those are the words she's reported as saying by Jane Boleyn. So I think Jane is there in place, and Thomas Cromwell has put her in place. But again, this is fiction, or if you like, the wilder shores of speculation. I don't have any document that shows that Jane is ever paid by Thomas Cromwell, except all the money she gets could only have come to her, I think, by his goodwill.
It is, however, I know you're saying speculation. It is, however, informed speculation, and I think that's
it's very grounded in the history.
I think that's one of the gems of your fiction work, in that you work with the mind of a historian because you are a historian, and so that speculative point is what we all do as historians when we're sitting around chatting. You just channel it into a fiction and an outlet that is still ground in the facts, in the historical facts. So I think that's what really draws people into your work specifically, Philippa. But I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned afterwards that there's the 3 successive queens that she's still there for. Give us an idea of what that looks like for Jane at that time. What is that experience like for her, and why? You've hinted at it already, but let's get to the kind of heart of it. Why do you think that's such an unusual position for her to find herself in?
Well, it's a not uncommon position for a woman, widowed as she is, to become, as it were, a career courtier. And again, this is quite new history that most historians up until now have not been very interested in the ladies in waiting. And so you miss out the women career courtiers. We all know that Thomas Howard is always there doing stuff. We all know that Thomas Stanley is there always doing stuff. We know that the royal dukes are always around the court and that they get different jobs to do, often warfare, often diplomacy, sometimes politics. But there hasn't been a lot of study of the women's side of things and what the women are doing in the Queen's Court, which runs parallel, but it is quite separate. But it has its own hierarchy. It has its own pensions, it has its own pay, it has its own working conditions and traditions. And we see that really clearly when we have a queen on the throne, because then, as it were, the Queen's Court becomes much more important as the intimate court of the Queen, and the men's court becomes the external court of the Queen. But nonetheless, there were substantial Queen's courts to every one of Henry's queens, and they all had career diplomats and almost certainly spies and ladies in waiting and supporters and cheerers and best friends attached. Jane, as a widow, is wealthy enough to step back from all of that and retire to her estates. But, she's not very old. She's only in her 30s. I think she was a career courtier from a child.
Right.
I think she would be bored to death.
It's the world she knew
in the country. Also, this isn't Blickling Hall, Norfolk, with the communication that it is now. You'd go there, you'd disappear off the end of the world. Nobody would ever remember you again. Yeah. So she's been at the heart of everything that matters ever since she was a child of 12. She's not, since she isn't yet scarred, and since she isn't yet really conscious of the danger that she's in, since she's got, I think, in Cromwell, a very, very astute patron, spy master, who is asking her questions. And she has this terrific sense that we all know of being absolutely in on the secrets. And in her case, these are the secrets of a nation. You know, there's very few people that you see who have been in power who step away from it. It doesn't happen very often. Most of the time people want to stay in, and if they can get back, they do. And she has this extraordinary opportunity after the collapse of her husband and sister-in-law to step right back into the court of a very inexperienced queen. So Jane Boleyn knows much better than Jane Seymour how Jane Seymour should behave.
Yeah.
And she knows a ton better than Anne of Cleves, who's a foreign princess anyway.
Yes, and who is clueless on some level, and then also acting potentially more clueless than she really is. In terms of Jane's return to court, though, after everything that happens with Anne and George, is there a world in which she's not welcome because of those associations and because of the downfall of that family? And is it therefore Cromwell who facilitates her place at this court? Or is she in and of herself a popular figure? Why is she allowed to stay for so long?
You don't get to be lady-in-waiting to the Queen of England because people like you. It's a paid post. It's an incredibly desirable post. You get it by bribing the court officials or by being so important yourself that you get the post. So it's got to be Cromwell. The only other person who might have got it for her might have been Thomas Howard, but she's not a direct relation to him, and we don't see her serving him in any way at all through the next stages. The next stage is the next time she serves Thomas Howard, it's at the time of the reign of Anne of Cleves. But you couldn't have foreseen that then, because it's Jane Seymour and she gets pregnant within the first year of marriage. So, in a way, you might go, job done. All we need, from Thomas Cromwell's point of view, he probably goes, what I need is a really, really, really reliable pair of eyes and a reporter at Jane Seymour's court. And Jane would have known, both Janes knew each other. Jane Seymour knew Jane Boleyn, but I don't think she was tainted in a sense by the accusations against her husband and her sister-in-law, because I think everybody will have been absolutely terrified by that. It's not just them who are killed. Remember, there are six men are charged, 5 other men are killed. So there's other men who are charged and released, and there's other men who aren't charged, but whose names are in a sense, on the books. So I think it's like a shadow going across the court. I think everybody goes like, let's keep our heads down. Let's see how it pans out. Let's hope to God Jane Seymour gets a baby, and that we end up, as we have been always before, with a king and a queen who may or may not like each other at the time, but nobody gets killed.
Yes. And everyone's fulfilling their function and their roles,
And, as in the present day, something happens and you all go like, gosh, that's absolutely terrible. That's never happened before. And you're very quick to go like, it probably will never happen again. We'll just stay quiet and hope that it passes on. And in the case of Henry, and I would say all tyrants, it just gets worse.
Yes.
What we have then, and you're talking about this kind of game of stakes and game of politics that Jane is very much part of, one way or the other, even if it's not Cromwell. But I think it's pretty persuasive that this is why she's in place. But almost inevitable in the Tudor court, if you've managed to survive for X amount of time, is a downfall. And Jane experiences a downfall too. Let's touch on that and talk to us about how that comes about, Philippa.
Well, like everything in history, there's a lot of reasons for anything that ever happens. I think the fact that Cromwell loses his hold over Henry and is executed actually on Catherine of Howard's wedding day, which is just typical bad taste of Henry. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that identifies tyrants is they always have the most awful manners. So there we go. But she loses then, I think, her spy master. But I think she loses her patron. And I think she loses a key advisor. So now she is playing a very dangerous game. She hasn't got anyone to report to. She hasn't got anyone to advise her. And she hasn't got anyone to help her if she gets into a jam. So she's now very much on her own, and she is looking after a queen who is very, very young. We're not sure Catherine Howard's actual age, but she's a teenager, she's a young teen. And she is now Queen of England with no training and no education and no background for this role. And she behaves understandably like a child in a sweet shop. She's terribly greedy for jewels and things like that. And she falls in love, I believe, sincerely and totally with a young man who isn't steady or reliable or very safe, but is hugely attractive, Thomas Culpeper, an adventurer. And she begs Jane to help them meet. And here accounts differ. They all end up charged with adultery or helping the adultery, and they all blame each other. Culpeper and Catherine mostly blame Jane, and Jane doesn't say actually as much as they do, but she says that they demanded it and that she acceded to their demands. What she's actually doing, given that she's as clever as I believe she is, I think she may have thought that there's only one way that Catherine Howard is going to get pregnant, and that's if she has sex with somebody other than Henry VIII, who is now been impotent and proclaimed his impotence with 3 preceding queens. So he's not father material.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in anybody's mind that this is not very hopeful. Yes. During the marriage to Catherine Howard, although when we read about it, we normally read about this sort of December, May blooming of Henry. He has a complete 6 weeks, 8 weeks when he just closes the door in Hampton Court and won't see anybody and just stays in his room and eats. He's prone to these period of deep depression and ill health. So they think he's not going to live. So I think Jane quite sensibly calculates that there's a very good chance that if she can get Catherine Howard pregnant by another man, or allow Catherine Howard to sleep with the man that she's longing to sleep with, Catherine might get pregnant, in which case Henry will marry her, in which case she'll be queen, in which case if he dies soon, which everybody thinks he's going to, Catherine will become Dowager Queen with a very good chance of being on the Regency Council of her son. She's a Howard. It's Jane's house. She's in touch with Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. If it had worked, it would have been an extraordinary power play. And you would have seen Jane, the power behind the throne of the Queen Dowager, possibly advising on a second marriage for the Queen Dowager. She could have married Thomas Culpeper then, and her son would have been King of England. So it's not a stupid thing to do. In the circumstances she's in, it's not the best thing to do. The best thing to do would probably be to keep her head down and try and keep the lid on Catherine Howard. But this is a very impulsive teen in love for the first time, who no one has ever said no to in probably all her life. I think you couldn't have kept the lid on Catherine Howard. You couldn't keep the lid on Thomas Culpeper, who's an adventurer. And so what she does is she does the best she can with it and constructs this really, really compelling possible future and hopes it's going to happen. And of course, what does happen is the reverse, in that they are caught.
Yes.
And Catherine loses her head in the interrogation. She's not with Jane. Jane can't advise her. And Catherine ends up thinking she's throwing everybody off the scent, but in effect, giving them enough evidence to pick up Culpeper and his friends and her previous the previous men in her life, who were probably in any case abusers. But the Tudor mind doesn't go there. And actually neither did the Victorian mind. So we have Jane as the reputation of being lascivious, immoral, light-hearted and very stupid, whereas in fact her story is much more complicated and interesting than that.
The way that you're describing Jane as well, Philippa, I'm amazed by how savvy and skillful she actually is, especially towards the end when she's lost Thomas Cromwell as a spy master. And I think you touched on it earlier, talking about, there's this sort of, and I suppose it probably does come from those Victorian historians, and I think we're still dealing with it today and struggling to unpick it. This idea that the Tudor court is predominantly run by men, that it's men doing the scheming, the plotting, and that the women's court and those ladies in waiting who are so close to any queen in this period are just there to provide a bit of decoration, to, a little bit of gossip. Maybe they might know some secrets about who fancies who, or who's sleeping with who, but beyond that they have no real power or influence. And what you're explaining here with Jane is that actually she's a key player throughout this history, for all three of these queens, that she's so central to what's happening, both good and bad, and that she is playing a game in terms of the wider court and where she sees herself and the direction that she wants that court to go in. Actually, she is influencing royal history and royal politics, but also that she's a survivor and that she's out for herself as much as anyone else. And there's something so powerful in that. I'm really compelled by this idea that she has more power than I maybe imagined, which is, I think, a sort of a kind of internalized misogyny, I suppose, that we're all, like I say, still dealing with this Victorian idea that these women held no power and were of no particular interest.
I think it's true. And if you think of, medieval women are normally identified in stereotypes. Mm-hmm. So you have, the virgin, mm-hmm. Who becomes the virgin bride, and then you have the wife who hopefully is fertile, or you have the Eve, the mm-hmm. adulteress, the woman who doesn't understand that her husband's honour is her honour and that she should mm-hmm. defend that, and that's the most important thing. And then you have sort of the widow and the hag. What you don't have is any stereotype of a clever woman who plans her own life and is her own agent. There is
autonomy does not exist.
There are hags and there are sluts, mm-hmm. but there is no idea. There's no stereotype of a scholar. Mm. There's no stereotype of an artist. There's no stereotype of female genius. Mm-hmm. All of these stereotypes are
only muses, never really genius.
They're not misogynist in the sense that they are anti-women, so mm-hmm. I'm not complaining, but they are misogynist in the sense that women are just absent.
Yes.
And, one of the things that really strikes me about history, which why I wrote my book, Normal Women, 900 Years of Making History, it's a history of women in England, that women are just absent from the record, and you don't notice it because they're not there. Similarly, in Tudor history, we don't notice, because the books are very often called Six Wives of Henry VIII, we don't notice that it's six stereotypes of Henry VIII. Yes. We don't observe the fact that these are not described to us as persuasive, real women mm-hmm. trying the best in their own lives for themselves, for their families, for their husband, for their children, if they have children.
And they're only understood in terms of the king as well, the six wives of Henry VIII.
Exactly. And mm-hmm. that's why, memorably, you hardly hear about any of Henry's mistresses, because mm-hmm. basically historians have gone, we've got six wives, that's enough. But anyway, that's too many women. Too many already. Yeah. So Jane is one of these forgotten women because mm-hmm. there are, in a sense, too many women in the Henry court for historians to grapple with. Yes. And the other thing is that her story is so incomprehensible if you don't go, here's a woman with agency mm-hmm. trying to survive, trying to prosper, and trying every now and then to pull off a real coup.
Yes, if you remove that element of her personality and who she was, some of her behaviour and the places we find her in are sort of inexplicable, really, aren't they?
They're inexplicable, and we do fall back on the fact it's got to be something irrational, like lust or just madness. Because why else is she doing this?
Yeah. That we're filling in those gaps, but actually maybe the filling in is far more obvious than we have thought to think before.
So, Philippa, Jane has this incredible propensity for plotting and survival and all of that, but we do know that her downfall comes to the extent where she is potentially forced to feign madness in order to survive, and that even then that doesn't work for her. So what happens? What is the end of her story, without giving too much of the novel away?
Well, it's history, so you can
Google it.
It is available on Wikipedia.
I think she comes up with a strategic plan, even in the Tower of London, even when in my novel she is in the room where her husband waited for his execution, even though she can see Tower Green, where her sister-in-law was executed. So she knows the stakes are incredibly high. And in my version of events, she pretends to be mad, and Henry VIII sends his private physician to see her. And in my version of the events, the private physician reports her as insane, but knows that she's pretending. And that puts her under the protection of the law, which says that people who are mad in the Tudor law cannot be executed. The assumption is that God has already punished them for whatever they've done. There's no point beheading them. They have lost their minds. So normally you'd go into the care of your family if you were noble, and if you were poor, you would have the incredible mercy of being chucked on the streets or imprisoned for life. But either way, she's going to survive. And in the history, we know she is released to Admiral Russell and his wife and their beautiful house on the Strand. And she stays there over Christmas, and she's examined quite frequently. And then Henry, the king, deliberately and mindfully changes the law on madness. So mad people can be executed. And the first person to be executed under this new law, and in my view, the only one he wanted, is Jane herself.
Classic Henry VIII behaviour, that, isn't it?
It's so often personal with him when he changes those laws. So it makes sense.
But it's also classic tyrant behaviour, that tyrants use the law for their personal vindictiveness. And you see it in Henry, and we see it all around the world now. And it's one of the real kind of warning signs that you've gone beyond having a bit of a narcissist running the country. You've stepped into tyrant territory.
I wonder who you're talking about, Philippa. Who could you possibly be referencing? We're surrounded by it at the moment. That's so interesting, and I think it says something about the vindictiveness and the insecurity of the Henry VIII, as well as saying something about the potential strategizing. Again, this is the word that keeps coming to me when we're talking about Jane, is strategizing, and how easily women are so overlooked in terms of their strategy making in this time period, anything up to the 19th, 20th century, really. So you are building this more complex world where we can see women as power brokers and as participants in power. And I think that's really, really valuable as well. By the way, if you haven't read Philippa's book, Normal Women, please do. And in addition, listen to the podcast, because I think what the podcast does, which is it accompanies the book, it brings those histories right into the modern day. And you're speaking to some incredible women on there about the ways in which adjacently these histories are informing everyday lives and how people are relating to those lives today. But I want to talk to you about something else before we let you go. You're a very busy person, so we have to let you go at some point. But I want to talk to you about a little book called The Other Boleyn Girl. You may have heard of it. It might crop up for you every now and again. You know, I like to ask obscure questions. But when you were approaching, a new novel, and it's time to sit down at the computer for the first day, or however you write, at a laptop, whatever it is, how on earth do you choose what is coming next? Because it's hard enough for the rest of us, but we don't have the scrutiny and the expectation. Sorry to tell you all of this. Well, the book's written now, but people have expectations, and they have desires of what you might be able to bring them. And so how does that sit on your shoulders on day one?
It's lovely that I'm very sorry, readers, but I don't think about them at all, because partly if I thought about them, I would make sure I didn't think about them, because the last thing you can do when you're starting a novel is think about the readers. I think it would be chokingly discouraging. But also, I'm not interested in anything. I am. By the time I sit down to write it, I've done something like a year of research on this character. I am just desperate to start telling her story and to be inside her head. I want the experience of writing. I'm not thinking about the experience of reading. That's another year away. I'm very... I now understand, it's taken me a little while, but I'm actually very obsessive at the time. So I'm in my study, the door's shut, the dog's on under the desk, ideally. And in this case, Jane Boleyn and I are starting the story of her extraordinary adventure that nobody has ever told before. And nothing's going to stop me there. I am in love with my work. I just want to be with it all day.
And then does that wrangle a little bit when, you have to then start sharing that a little bit when you're like, oh, now I have to hand this over, and there's editors, and then eventually there's it starts to go to the print, and then you have to book tour it. And does it feel like a different experience, a different product then?
It's a different job altogether.
It is, isn't it?
It's a completely different job. And it's not my favourite. It's not my favourite job. I mean, I do it, and I am always, always, always glad to see the book go out, and it does have that excitement about it. But I do a series of lecture tours. I'm going to be doing it for this book. It's a very different thing to talk to you about the book, or to stand up on stage and talk to an audience about the book, from the nun-like solitude of my study in the country, where it's just me and Jane, and every now and then I'll stop and say, why did you do that? And then I go like, I know why you did it, and nobody else knows why you did it. And the thrill of that is unlike real life. That's why it works as a novel, that people in their real lives go to it and it catches them up and it takes them somewhere else. And the power of it is that sometimes in that story you can say something about real life that you can't say another way. And that's why it's important, as well as tremendously enjoyable to me.
Philippa, I can't wait to read The Boleyn Traitor. When is it out, and where can people buy it?
It's out on October the 7th, and you can get it anywhere you get your books.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, as someone who writes at home in her pyjamas with her dogs under the desk, I feel a little bit like I'm going to be emulating
Affirmed.
Philippa Gregory next time I sit down to write. Yes, I feel thoroughly legitimised. If you've enjoyed this episode of After Dark, you can leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps other people to discover the show. If you have a suggestion for a topic or a guest that you would like to see on, then you can let us know at afterdark@historyhit.com. See you next time.